All right. Well, welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janelle Wood. And friend, if you are a regular listener to this podcast, you know that I invite young women from various backgrounds to share their stories and bring their big questions or objections about faith here for conversation. Together, we then invite Christian guests to join us for further conversations about the issues and questions that they share. I'm a Christian, as you know, and I found the real thing in Jesus Christ, and I want others to find that too. But I don't want people to just take my word for it. I want you to find out for yourself by looking into these things and exploring whether the most real things in life, being restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love, can ultimately be found in relationship with Jesus Christ. And this is it. Today, we are wrapping up season 7. And this episode is, well, first of all, it's going to be great because I'm very excited about today's special guest joining me. And I'm very excited to introduce that person to you here in just a moment. But it's also a little different. And I just wanted to acknowledge that up front here because I'm actually going to be taking a sabbatical from podcasting. This has been a weekly program for over 5 years, and I love this work, so it's hard to step back. But I sense that in order to make room for new things, I need to release some things that I've been holding on to and just set them aside for a little bit. And I want to be faithful to acknowledge that in my life. So my plan is to stop, to rest, and to listen. And I want to keep writing, and I hope you've signed up for the weekly emails we send out. You can do that by visiting findingsomethingreal.com. I hope you stay in touch because I'm excited for what's to come in 2025. But I am pressing pause while I prayerfully consider next steps in 2025. So real quick here, I just want to take a moment and say thank you. Thank you to the two young women who have worked behind the scenes to produce this podcast this year, Tara and Anna. I am so grateful for both of you and all your hard work and faithfulness. Thank you to Diego, Andrea, Priscilla, and the rest of the team at Worldview Media. Thank you for taking the raw material of this podcast and making beautiful finished things. Thank you especially to Noelle, to Lizzie, Olivia, and Dagmar, who have co-hosted and shared their stories on the podcast this season. Thank you. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing your worldview and your stories with us. And thank you to all the special guests we've had on here to talk about my co-host questions and answer some of mine too. And finally, and most of all, thank you to the supporters and listeners of this podcast. I appreciate you so much. Finally, if you'd like to hear more about the decision to take a sabbatical, there is a link to a letter I wrote about it on the show notes, and you can find that at findingsomethingreal.com. Over the past few weeks, we've been dedicating episodes to my friend and someone I would say is part of my Dutch family. We're not related by blood, but I just love her and her family, Dagmar from the Netherlands. If you remember, Dagmar's sister, Lika, was our very first exchange student. She lived with us for 10 months, and she started a whole series of family that we now consider or people that we now consider family throughout the world. And we just love her. And she's not a Christian, but she's been on the podcast before with lots of introspective questions about faith. And this time she came on and shared about where she's currently at with Christianity. And although she said she didn't have a lot of lingering faith questions herself anymore, she's in school. And so she went around and asked some of her fellow students what questions they might have about Christianity. And we'll share a clip of some of what she said in that conversation right here.
As I told you, I don't really have any more questions of my own, but I asked around to some other people of my age, a little bit younger than me, and they did come up with some questions. So I'm here to kind of advocate for them in the harsh critic way that I am. Well, I think that a lot of people of like my age, and especially in like secular countries, they don't really have the opportunity to talk openly about it with people close to them. And I think that a lot of the main questions that people have when they think of Christianity are answered in this podcast, and they're answered deeply and thoroughly. And even if you're not a part of those conversations, you can probably, or most likely, you can take some part of it with you. Be like, yeah, well, this is also a point of view, and this is also a point of view, and maybe they're not the same, but you can look at them and kind of make a little puzzle in your mind and figure out what works for you.
Dagmar couldn't be here today, but today's special guest is Dr. Craig Hazen. Craig Hazen works with Stand to Reason in a role that was created solely for him, Chief Strategy Officer. He is the founder and director of the Master of Arts program in Christian Apologetics at Biola University, where he has trained thousands of students and leaders worldwide in the art of defending Christianity. He's an accomplished author of various publications, including the acclaimed apologetics novel, Five Sacred Crossings, and a book that I just read and loved, Fearless Prayer, Why We Don't Ask and Why We Should. Craig is a recipient of the Fischer Award, the highest faculty honor at Biola, and has lectured across North America and Europe on key apologetics topics, including lectures on Capitol Hill and in the White House. He is a popular church and conference speaker and a former co-host of a national radio program. Craig Hazen, I'm honored to welcome you to the Finding Something Real podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Janelle.
Well, this is a real treat, Craig, because I can't say this about every guest that has been on this podcast, but I got to meet you in person a few weeks ago. I was at the Reality Student Conference done by Stand to Reason with my daughter and some friends. And I kept running into this familiar face. So finally, I just started talking to this person, you. And I think I was wearing something with a Maven logo on it. And you started making jokes about Brett Kunkel, which, I mean, let's be honest, it's fun to make jokes about Brett Kunkel. And because we love him. And yeah, I kept running into you. There were thousands of people there. And I kept seeing you over and over again.
Yeah, and I could spot you because you had that Maven shirt on. It's like a moth to a flame. I had to find out what that was all about.
Well, it was really sweet. And I kept noticing you too. And I think I was standing in line with a student who we were getting the book signed by Greg Kokel, and you were just sitting there. And so I started asking you about what books you must have written, because I figured you had, and of course you had. And you went out and you got a couple copies of your book. You brought them back and you gave them to me. And it was so precious and such an unexpected gift. And I got so excited because one of the books was about prayer. And I told you that I'd been wrestling with some of that passage in John. I think it's John chapter 15. Is that right? Yeah. And you said, did you pray for this book? And anyway, it was really funny. And I took it home back to that. My friend and I were staying in a hotel down the road. And I woke up early that morning in my quiet time. I picked up your book and I started reading it. I actually got tears in my eyes. It was just one of those things where I thought, wow, Lord, that was so loving and kind of you. And then a couple hours later, my friend and I are going for a morning walk, and we turn around the corner, and there you are. You were.
Wait, that's when it got weird.
Yeah, so this guy has to be on the podcast.
Saw you several times at the conference. That was a closed environment, so yeah. It wasn't outlandish that I would bump into you three or four times. But then the next morning I see you, I go, okay, I better pay attention to this. And you told me a gripping story. I won't repeat it here, but it stayed with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was about, I can't share all the details here because it's still in process, but the gist of it is never stop praying for things. You just never know what God's going to do. And, I got to run into some family members that I love and see them for the first time in years. And I've been praying for an opportunity like that for a very long time. And it was all unexpected. And to be able to share that story with you. And then, for my friend and I to talk with you about ministry things too. It just was such a blessing. And to get to pray together too. So I am so grateful that you were willing to come on here. And the more I read your book, I mean, well, first of all, over the past few years, I've had the privilege of having multiple guests on from Stand to Reason. And I have to say that the speakers that have come on here, including Greg Kokel, Robbie Lashua, John Noyes, Tim Barnett, I hope I'm not forgetting anybody, all very knowledgeable, very gracious, and excellent communicators. So tell me about your new job with Stand to Reason, because it's a wonderful resource. I know we've mentioned it many times on this podcast, but I'd love for you to share briefly about what you're doing there and what Stand to Reason does.
Yeah, my story with Stand to Reason really has, at this point still in time, has a lot more to do with my leaving Biola. And for goodness sakes, I was there for 27 years.
Wow.
I started their Master of Arts degree program in Christian Apologetics. And and ran it for all those years and just enjoyed it thoroughly and had a great time. But all the doors opened to take a step out. And it wasn't scary. It wasn't anything because it was just so clearly a well lighted pathway out. And so I started looking around to see what could I do with all the skills and knowledge I've developed over the years if I'm not working at Biola anymore, teaching graduate students. And there was this need at Stand to Reason, and they actually came up with a name for this position, maybe to entice me, but Chief Strategy Officer. Chief Strategy. I thought that sounds kind of cool. In other words, if I had some business cards printed, I wouldn't mind Chief Strategy Officer. That might actually intrigue people. So
it does.
Yeah, it wasn't anything deeper than that. But once I dug into Stand to Reason, and I'd been on their board for years, so I already knew a lot about Stand to Reason. But as I dug in, it just occurred to me that they actually need help, but not in the way you would think. Not because they're hurting or going down or spiraling away or anything like that, because they need help to consolidate all of the amazing things that have happened in their midst over the years. The kinds of ministry that they've been doing. The very conference that we met at was a reality conference. It kind of came together by the hand of the Lord and dropped in the lap of Stand to Reason. I never saw Stand to Reason as a bunch that was going to be running basically a student or youth conference. And not only that, I didn't expect 2,500 people to show up. Then in Minnesota, a couple of weeks afterwards, 4,000 people show up.
Wow.
There is a huge hunger out there for clear thinking Christianity. I think there's a lot of people who've been toying with the idea of Christianity, but have been holding back because they've been so influenced by the internet and by skeptical friends, teachers, colleagues, family members. And so I think there's a real place for the kind of work that Stand to Reason does, offering some of the finest answers you could imagine to the most difficult questions that people are asking today, especially students.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm excited. So what you're going to be doing is helping expand what they're doing in a way that's more strategic. Is that, to use one of the words in your job description?
And so they've been doing all these wonderful things. Well, I get to look like a genius because I come in and say, hey, if we put piece A together with piece B and, toss piece F in there, it might really go to town. And I think that's entirely possible. I've worked for, many strange organizations over the years. And usually if they're bringing me in, it's a sign of death for the institution. Not because I'm going to kill it off, because it's already dying and they need to bring somebody in to kind of put it to bed, And so that is not the case with Stand to Reason. I walk in and there's just it's like walking into a pirate's, lost treasure. And it's all right there. And I get to start molding it, putting it together. But there's so many wonderful pieces to work with that it's kind of off the charts. And they've got this amazing, I call them the faculty, a group of speakers who can address any number of topics at a very high level, or if need be, at a very low level. If they do a good job with kids, but they also do a good job with seasoned professors who are experts in their field. So it's an amazing group, and I'm really thrilled to be a part of them. It's a little overwhelming because there's so much potential. I want to work 8 days a week to make it happen. So I have to get reined in by somebody, but Stand to Reason has done wonderful work, and I couldn't recommend them more. Like I said, I've been on their board for maybe 20 years. So that shows my commitment to them. So if anybody has any, lingering questions about the truth of Christianity or modern problems like, transgenderism or something like that, str.org, str.org, standtoreason.org. that'll get you to a place you want to go. Tremendous archive of materials to answer some of those toughest questions. So if you're writing a term paper, if you're in a bit of a argument with your neighbor over some important religious issue and you want to be able to present first rank material with a grace and kindness that you don't even know you have inside of you, go check out Stand to Reason and what they have to offer. I think it's just tremendous, and I'm thrilled to be a part.
I love that, and I love that you're so enthusiastic about it too. I mean, it's contagious. I can see how you were able to lead. I mean, the Biola Apologetics program, one of the top, if not the top, apologetics graduate programs in the world, right? I mean,
yeah, I'd rank it there.
Yeah, I want to ask you so many questions, but I do want to get to a couple things. So we'll see if we have time for some of the things I really want to ask you. But you didn't grow up in a Christian home. Why are you a Christian?
That's funny. So my dad, he's 89 years old. I visit him, he lives in another state, but I still visit him about once a month. And so I gave him my latest book, thinking that'd occupy him for a little while. But it was called Fearless Prayer. And in the book, I talk about, just growing up in a non-Christian home. Well, he's reading this book and he calls me up. He goes, "Hey, well, what's this about you not growing up in a Christian home?" And I go, "Uh-oh, I should have cut those pages out before I gave it to Dad, I go, "Well, Dad, from your perspective, you probably thought it was a Christian home, but from me, I mean, I was nothing but an agnostic and atheist. I didn't believe any of that stuff, And I mean, he had to admit that, yeah, okay, we didn't go to church, and not even on Easter and Christmas, really. So yeah, well, that's the environment, and I'm the third kid in the family. So even if they were doing it for brother number one and brother number two, by the time they got to me, nobody was going to church anymore. Of course, that happened too with Boy Scouts and Little League and everything else. My brothers, the older ones, oh yeah, they got to do it. But by the time it got to me, it's like, Craig, yeah, we should. Fortunately, they would stick a book in my hands and send me to a corner, and I actually really liked that. So,
yeah. So
my dad, yeah, he's like, he thinks we're a Christian family. Now he is a Christian, and looking back on it, I think he's reading his newfound Christianity into his own past. But so that was. But I certainly did not grow up in a Christian home. I mean, I do not remember darkening the door of a church until I was a senior in high school. And I only went to a church then because some cute chick invited me to one,
So you get invited to church, and then what happened?
Well, so by the time I was a senior in high school, I'd actually thought a lot about, religious issues. At least I thought I had, it was pretty low level stuff, but nonetheless, I showed interest. I mean, I could actually pinpoint my own interest on a, time map. And I think I was a very careful agnostic. And looking back on it, I go, my position was actually fairly sophisticated for a high school senior, because I didn't have anything against the Christians who were clearly out there praying for me. They thought I would make a good Christian. I didn't know what that meant, but nonetheless, they were always praying for me. And so I was an agnostic, which meant to me that I'd had nothing against their religious belief at all. In fact, I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad you have something to lean on like that. I don't think I really need that. And then they'd want to have a little bit of a tete-a-tete, a little bit of head-to-head conversation. And I'd say, look, you might be right, but I just don't think there's any way to, and this is the important word, there's no way to know it. There's no way to know it. So God might very well exist, but you just can't know that. Jesus might be the Son of God, but she can't really know that. That's where you close your eyes and you leap into, whatever religion you've chosen. At the end of the day, it really is about blind leaping, and I think we all have to admit that. Well, my Christian friends, they had no answers for that. In fact, that was a fairly sophisticated response to them, and they didn't know what to do. So there's this one group of students and was praying for me, and then one of them was a girl who we were good friends, but she decided to take it on her own and said, "I'm going to invite this guy to church." So she takes me to a place called Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa, and if you're not familiar with that was like front and center in the Jesus movement. It was like, in fact, it was like the center point of the Jesus movement. It wasn't the Jesus Revolution movie. Was really about Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. Well, I hadn't been to a church really ever, except maybe once or twice to an Episcopal church when I could barely remember. So she brings me to this church, and I thought it was interesting. It was huge. It was all young people. It was a Monday night, which kind of threw me off. I thought Christians do stuff on Sunday, but this is just a big Monday night concert / evangelistic meeting. And I get there and sit down, and people are very enthused. I just really had no idea. I'd never seen anything, never felt anything quite like that before. So I sit down, and the gal who brings me, she sits next to me. She's probably praying for me the whole time, You got this.
I sure hope so.
Church, God, it's up to you now. I have no idea what she was praying, but it was probably something like that. Oh, and by the way, the guy who was playing the special music that night was a guy named Keith Green.
Very famous, well-known.
Yeah. Now, those of you out there who know who Keith Green is, you go back a ways first. And second, it's like God was polishing the best silverware for me, at my little gospel feast. I'm going, oh my gosh, this guy's a Christian. He is just an amazing musician. So I totally enjoyed how it got started with the special music. And then there was this guy named Greg Laurie, who did the event.
Another very well known.
Yeah, very famous evangelist, probably second only to Billy Graham. And he's the guy giving the gospel message. I still remember the topic to this day. The topic wasn't important. It's just that I heard it and I actually absorbed it, and it intrigued me. I didn't know what to think about it, but I felt something strange just looking around and knowing that what are all these people about my age doing here on a Monday night? This is what they're doing, and they seem like they really like each other and they really want to be here. And so that intrigued me enough that when they did an altar call, which they did, I remember thinking to myself, you know what harm could it do? I'm going to do a little experiment. I see they're calling people forward. I'm going to go. I don't know a soul here except for this gal sitting next to me, who was probably just praying like there's no tomorrow for me. And so I waited till, and I didn't know exactly the right moment, but I knew it seemed to be winding down because they were singing some sort of hallelujah thing. And it sounded to me like they were getting to the last Luya. And they did it. And so they do the last Luya. That's when I made my break. I jumped out of the pew and I shoot forward. And so they said a few words and they prayed with us. And then they sent us into the back room. Now I figured, in my mind, that's probably where they do the brainwashing. There's something that turns a guy like me into people like them. And I didn't know what it would be. So I went forward. That seemed a bit innocuous. And then they sent me into the back room. Well, when I got to the back room, the fellowship hall or whatever it was, there were people waiting for us. In fact, there were counselors positioned around the room, and they were guiding the new believers. And there were a lot of them. They were guiding the new believers into little circles with each counselor. So, a group of new believers would be connecting with a counselor. They gave us a free Bible, said a few kind words, and then said, do you have any questions? Well, I had some questions. Most of the people seemed to say, no, no, thank you for the Bible. And they got up and they walked out. For me, though, I was asking them questions. I wish I could remember what exactly they were. I could probably guess, but they were fairly typical questions that a teenager just wrapping up high school would be asking about religion and Christianity and so on. And so I was peppering them with questions. Most everybody else had cleared out of the room, all the new believers. But now all the counselors kind of moved in on my position and were encircling me like they weren't going to let me escape, And so I was asking questions, and God bless them, they were doing their best to answer some of them. I do remember them saying on a number of times, I'm not sure about an answer to that, but I know some people who can help. And that intrigued me. And so God bless them. They didn't let me leave without at least some new exploration. So they put like books in my hand. You got to read these books with questions like that. I think you'd really enjoy them, and they'd mean a lot. And they were right. Back in the day, it would be books like More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell, or maybe Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and books like that. That really highlighted what we call apologetics, offering reasons for faith. So I was glad to have those. They also told me about some radio programs I should be listening to. And they gave me some cassette tapes to listen to, just to date myself a little bit. And I devoured all that stuff. And I got to tell you, I didn't really talk to anybody except my chemistry teacher in high school. I knew she was a religious person. I didn't know if it was Christian or not. I mean, she taught in a public high school, and she had these like cryptic God posters on the wall. Back in the 70s, these were hot items. It wasn't just hang in there, baby, the little cat on the string. But they actually had, waterfalls and little, pieces of one of the Psalms, but it didn't identify it as one. So that way you could actually have it up on a public school wall, apart from this one chemistry teacher, who, by the way, I really give primary credit for introducing me to Christianity, because she lived the Christian life every day, and it bugged the tar out of me. I'm like, why does she seem to have a peace, an abiding peace in her, and I got nothing like that. So it was that just the lifestyle that she was living moment by moment in the classroom that really captured my attention. I go, if anybody would know what's going on, I'll bet she would. I bet you she would. She's got those God posters on the wall and all that. And so she answered a few of my questions, but most of what happened next is a result of listening to lectures and reading some books and tuning in on a couple of radio broadcasts. It wasn't long before this feeling I had in my heart at the big church made its way and tied some neural cord or something with my head, the intellectual center of being go. And I just woke up one morning going, oh my gosh, this might be true. I mean, that was just such a revelation. This might be true. And that just made me explore it all the more. And it wasn't long before, I kind of, I let that going forward at an altar call really sink in, and made that kind of a real point in my life. And there's just no turning back after that. And almost everything I do every day is kind of like a proof of Christianity, even the dark side of life is, the Bible's very clear that there is going to be some dark sides in life. And yep, that's the case. So everything seems to play out the way the Bible lays it out.
Have you, so you, first of all, it's a remarkable story. So you had gone forward without knowing whether it was true or not, kind of thinking probably not, it's not true, or intellectually where do you think you were? Because your questions came afterwards, after that spiritual experience. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, the questions were always there. When I went forward, it was, I really kind of considered it an experiment. I'm gonna go and see what happens. What harm
Yeah.
could it do? Uh, and the people seemed really nice.
Yeah.
And that was a big attraction right there. It's like there was a lot of people going forward, so I could kind of hide and make my way forward. So all of those
Yeah.
things played a role.
Yeah. So now, after all these years of in the beginning going, this might actually be true. What have you found? That was what? I don't want to date you, but 50 years ago, maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, you're being kind.
close to.
Uh,
No,
uh,
I'm just thinking the 70s, right? That was 50 years ago.
exactly. Yeah.
Jesus movement.
Yep.
So what have you found in 50 years of following Jesus? Do you still have those like, yeah, it's probably true, or are you more convinced than ever that
Are you
this
kidding?
is
I got obsessed with this whole thing. I mean,
tell us about
I
that.
spent the rest of my life basically doing bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctorates in the subject matter. So, I mean, if any question I had about Christianity, I had to go out and do another degree. Uh, and the two biggest questions that I had as a high school student, uh, the two reasons I go, I'm not sure the Christian take on all of this is probably correct because number one, really, Christianity is the only religion that's true out there. There's so many religions that have been around for so long. Like Buddhism has been around for 2,500 years. Christianity only for about 2,000. It's been around longer. And there's people who think it's just as true as Christians think their religion is true. And so that bothered me. What about the other religions? And then the second next most uh, prominent question in my mind was, what about science? It doesn't seem like Christianity comports or lines up with modern science. And so so I ended up doing a bachelor's degree in the biological sciences. And by the way, as an undergrad, I took every philosophy and religious studies course that I could legitimately cram into my schedule. I mean, they should have really given me a minor in like religious studies or something. But I did all this at secular schools. This was not like going to Bill's Bible College and getting a degree. It was thoroughly secular and hostile to traditional Christian beliefs. And it's even, as you know, it's even gotten worse. But, so I wanted to know about that religion piece, and so I ended up doing a master's degree and a Ph.D. in religious studies at a secular school, the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I got a chance to learn Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and Mormonism, you name it, from leading lights in the field, people who'd studied these things all their lives, many of whom were practitioners of those religions. And so I wanted to see how Christianity stood up against uh, those other great world religious traditions. So had the science issue and had the religion issue to work through. And I spent most of my life working through it. In fact, I'm still not finished working through it. Not that I'm looking for specific answers that are going to prove Christianity anymore. I'm more trying to answer the difficult questions that secular people bring up. Usually there's a flaw, and one of my goals is to find the flaw and make sure bright people know about it.
The culture is not, I'm thinking about Dagmar, and she lives in the Netherlands where things are, the current culture, her friend group, the people she surrounds herself with, they are not headed towards Jesus, right? It's a different direction. And when I think of Southern California, we were just there last week, and it's very much there's a current of materialism, hedonism, things that are headed a different direction than Jesus. How have you stayed grounded in the pursuit of, finding something real in Jesus all these years, Craig? Like, what is it that gripped you so much to not just go, man, I want to know more knowledge, but like, no, I want to be anchored to this Jesus.
Yeah, good question. I mean, the knowledge bit can only take you so far. And then at some point, you got to kind of give your whole self to it, knowledge, and all. And but to me, it made perfect sense to do that. At a certain point, when I kind of get to the threshold of exploration, you go, I'm studying, and suddenly you go over the top. And
Yeah.
it was an uphill climb. But once you get to the top, you go over and you go, whoa. I mean, I remember waking up in the morning going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I signed up for the right one. I became convinced that it was true and really the only game in town. And that's an important outcome of my exploration on the religion side, studying Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and so on. Are they really contenders for Christianity? I mean, is it possible that they're true and Christianity is not? I would say no. That's not possible. Given the nature of the evidence and good reasoning and working through the claims and the historical realities, Christianity is the only game in town. It's just the only game in town. And I say that with, I know people who are skeptics and unbelievers might take that hard. Go, wait a minute, but I'm saying that from the kinds of journey that I've taken. I've looked at the others very carefully, and they just don't hold a candle to Christianity in terms of the things that I think really go to the core of the human person. What makes them go, yes, this is the thing. And it's not just because I became a Christian, I have an easy life. It's not like that at all. It's just whether it's easy or not, I know God exists. I just beyond a shadow of a doubt, he exists. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, Jesus was a real historical figure who was killed at the hands of a Roman crucifixion team and came back from the dead on the third day, exactly as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and First Corinthians tell us. We can know these things to be true. We can know them. And that's why I love to talk about that knowledge, because unfortunately it's not as motivating to some people as it is to me, but it's wildly motivating to me. If I know something is the only game in town, I will follow it passionately. And how could I go wrong? I've looked at all the other games in town and they're not matching up. And even if I'm wrong about Christianity, I may not be going to a heaven, but I get to live this tremendous life in the Lord, whether he exists or not, in the here and now and for the rest of my life. And in my view, it's just, this is a classic Christian argument called Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
And that hey, even if you're wrong about it, you get to live this marvelous life that's been laid out by centuries of clear thinking Christianity and people who've given their lives for the cause.
It's interesting because after I met you a number of weeks ago, I was having a spiritual conversation with somebody I know, and she used to be a Christian, and she's kind of walked away from her faith. I would guess that she would probably still describe herself as a believer, a Christian. But she was explaining about how she was talking to a loved one, and they said, "Oh, I've looked at, in our class about history, and I'm looking at these religions, and I think they all are the same God. I think everybody's serving the same God. Everybody's got it right. It's just all these different ways." And I, asked some questions using some tactics I've learned from Greg and some, different things I've learned along the way. But at the end of the day, she just said something along the lines of, "If I'm wrong, oh well." And I said, "Oh," I said, "Well, Jesus had some different thoughts on that."
Yeah.
Or something like this. But how do you respond when you encounter somebody who, like you were, will say, "Well, it's no big deal"? I mean, even thinking about Dagmar, privately, her and I know she's okay with me sharing this, but we've been reading for years now. We've just read a chapter every few months, but John, and we got to John chapter 3, which is interesting because my husband and I just read it this morning. And afterwards, she expressed some concern. She's like, "Wait a second. Jesus says that even if you don't, you stand condemned already because you have not, chosen me," or whatever. And it's interesting when you read the words of Jesus, when you actually see what he has to say in black and white, it's like, wait a second. It's either him or it's, it's not. There's no in between. How do you respond lovingly to people who are where you used to be, Craig?
Yeah. It doesn't take long. In fact, I think it might take an afternoon of reading certain chapters of certain books to get a handle on what it is that Buddhism might teach, or Hinduism, and they're decidedly different than Christianity. In fact, if you want to say, oh well, what if I'm wrong? And if you're an adherent or practitioner of Buddhism or Hinduism, you could legitimately say that, because it's part of the system that you will actually get another opportunity in life to wander through and make your way and try to lose some of that karmic baggage you've got. So it actually makes sense with Hinduism and some of the Eastern religious traditions. But with Christianity, it's very clear, and this is one of the biggest problems people have with Christianity, it's very clear that Christianity is exclusive. It really is Jesus alone that saves. And it's Jesus alone who deals with the big problem that human beings have, and that's sin. And that's shaking our fist in rebellion at God and going our own way. So that has to be dealt with. If you have a religion that doesn't really deal with sin, that kind of pushes it off to the next life, or says that it's really not that big a deal, they're missing the boat on. In Christianity, at some point it has to be dealt with. And by the way, and the beauty of dealing with it in Christianity is that you do nothing to have it dealt with, except believe on him who dealt with it for you. There's nothing like it. I often give a lecture comparing some of the great world religious traditions, and I make a point. There's 5 or 6 things that I would really highlight, but if I had a chance just to highlight 2 of them, it would be this. The first one is that Christianity is a standout among the great world religious traditions, primarily because it's testable. It's testable. What I mean by that is you can offer evidence for it, you can offer evidence against it, and the evidence actually means something. In other words, you can become a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ or not, based on the weight of the evidence in the case. And that's not the case with other religions. It's not about that. It's not about making your evidential case. In fact, if you bump into some adherents to other religions, like a Zen Buddhist, for instance, they think that's just nutty. That's definitely the wrong way to approach religion. But that is central to Christianity. And there's this passage in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, starting with verse 12 and going to 19. 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 19, where the Apostle Paul says it twice. He says, if Jesus did not come back from the dead, our faith is false. And then he says it again in the same passage. So he wants to make sure we get this down. In other words, if the central claim of Christianity is not true, then Christianity is not true. And we really ought to go do something else. We're wasting our time. Wow. I guarantee you do not find that kind of honesty with the intellectual content of a given faith apart from Christianity. It's unique to Christianity. So that's one. And the second thing that really sets Christianity apart is that salvation in Christianity, or if you want to use a term that would be more familiar to Buddhists, something like enlightenment, but salvation in Christianity is a free gift from God. He just gives it to you. What kind of religion does that? Christianity. And it's the only one. The only one that actually sets it up such that God, he can't wait to give you this free gift of salvation. If you're willing to just kind of be real about your situation as a sinner and go, God, I'm sure I've disappointed you, but I want to know who you are. Forgive me and bring me to you. He'll do it like that. No questions asked. He just can't wait for that to happen. He wants to have that kind of deep, abiding relationship with us. And there's just nothing like it in the other great world religious traditions. They're always about climbing a ladder and what you can do to please God. In the case of Christianity, it's what can God do to drag us, even kicking and screaming, towards His love?
Wow. So that's another good segue. There's so many flavors of Christianity, and Dagmar and I were talking about this. And then there's stuff that from an outsider's perspective looks Christian, but it's very different. Jehovah's Witness and Mormon, for example. Why are there so many flavors, and how can someone like Dagmar, someone who is just considering this from the outside, know the difference between something real and something counterfeit? What advice would you give?
Yeah, well, some people slip into the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, because they simply don't know enough about Christianity to know that there's much of a difference. And honestly, I think in particular the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons tend to hide what they really believe, or what they have historically believed. They've kept it so it can be difficult for a new believer who's trying to sort out how all this works. They might actually be attracted to Mormonism or to the Jehovah's Witnesses because they sound like they're saying the same thing. So it takes a while to get a hold of the vocabulary and the arguments and the historical records to go, oh, wait a minute, there's something very different going on here. And it's and that's just a huge difficulty. And there's a great need for people who understand Christianity in a deep fashion, theologically and biblically, who can minister to people who are in movements like Mormonism and the Jehovah's Witnesses to make sure they understand the truth, as best they can know it.
Well, I was going to say, when Dagmar told me, and it's not just Dagmar, it's also Lika, two Dutch young women that I love very much, that their dad had converted to Jehovah's Witness. And then at some point, one or both of them was reading the Bible with him, and doing Bible studies and stuff. It's like, oh man, that's not the same thing, and so I'm looking online for different resources, and it's really hard to find. It's hard to find good, maybe that should be your next book, Craig. I don't know. But for somebody who maybe is watching this, who's like, wait a second, what's the big difference? Could you point to some resources or something that you know about the Jehovah's Witness? I know more about Mormonism, but and I know that there's more resources out there for that, but especially the Jehovah's Witness thing as it pertains specifically to Dagmar.
Yeah, one book I've always recommended, and I'm sure it is still a tremendous resource, is by an author by the name of Ron Rhodes. Ron, R-O-N, of course, and then Rhodes is R-H-O-A-D-S. R-H-O-A-D-S, Ron Rhodes. And he has a whole series of books with a similar title, but the one on the Jehovah's Witnesses is called Reading the Scriptures with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Reading the Scriptures with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he's got one, Reading the Scriptures with the Mormons, but I could recommend some other books that really can help give a bird's eye view of what the Mormons believe and how it differs from Christianity. For instance, McKeever and Johnson, Mormonism 101. McKeever and Johnson, Mormonism 101.
Thank you. See, I knew you would have some good resources. I have a lot of other things I want to ask you about, but we'll save that.
Empty out the bookshelves over there. We can really have a day.
Well, after my sabbatical, I'm going to have you back on if you're willing, because I'd love to ask you more questions. And we're running out of time here, but I have a couple final ones.
All right.
What difference do you think following Jesus has made in your life? And if you could go back 50 years, is there anything you would change about that young man who was like, I still have questions, but there's something here?
Wow. I mean, this is when I should get really animated, start throwing stuff around. This means everything. Wow. I mean, I have the same regret that others do. Why didn't I embrace Jesus earlier? Now, his timing was perfect. There's no doubt about that. But what all I can say is, what a journey it has been. What a joy and a journey it has been. It's not just that, well, I signed up for the right religion. Good for me. Now I got to go buy the religious garments and, and learn to say stuff in Latin. No, it's not like that at all. Suddenly the doors open, the colors are more vibrant, the lights are on, and you can't wait to tell the next person. It's funny that after I became a Christian, in about 2 or 3 years, I didn't have any non-Christian friends left. And it wasn't because I abandoned them. It's because almost all of them became Christians. They saw the changes in my life. They saw the excitement, the journey that I was on. And they go, oh my gosh, that's the thing. That's the thing I want to see. That's the same thing I saw in my chemistry teacher in high school. In fact, here's another tongue-in-cheek regret. Of course, books by Lee Strobel, which primarily focus on his move from atheism into Christianity as an adult, and then like J. Warner Wallace, the detective in Southern California, and his conversion to Christianity from atheism. I could have done that. I could have had a best-selling book, that charted my progress from atheism to Christianity. But, it's just not as compelling when it's an 18-year-old high school. So, but nonetheless, the change is the same. When those guys tell their testimonies, they go, I know exactly what they're talking about. This thing is true. And, what I would say to Dagmar is do an experiment. If you're intrigued and you think God might actually exist, maybe it's time to go, all right, God, I'm willing to give this a try. I'm willing to give this a try. I don't even know what I'm doing, but I'm gonna start acknowledging you in my day-to-day activities and so on. I'm gonna start looking at life as if you exist during the bad times, during the good times, and see what he does. See, here's the little secret that we know. That is, he's a person. He's not some force out there. He's not some a strange, unfeeling religious thing, some PowerPoint out there for religious people to tap into. No, he's a person. And I can guarantee this is why there's no real risk here. He loves you tremendously. And he can't wait to express that in new ways that you can only have when you finally commit to him. But you could do that as an experiment. In some ways, that's what I did when I walked forward. I did an experiment. He did not let me down one bit.
Yeah. Last question here. I always ask the same question of people. Finding something real is about a journey towards restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. REAL is an acronym for that. Restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. All things that can be found in relationship with Jesus Christ. Which of those things stands out to you the most in your life right now, and why? Restoration, eternity, authenticity, or love?
Yeah, love. Love is the key to the whole thing. The thing that I love, the idea of eternity. Don't get me wrong, but that's kind of for me and the ones I love. I want to see them thriving in eternity, and that's an amazing blessing. But you access that through love, and if you've ever had a full dose of the love of God, you can barely contain it. It's just not. Yeah, it's the engine that basically drives all the other things you mentioned, and it's exactly what God is. It says in the scriptures, God is love, and that's no trite poetic statement we're going to put on a greeting card. That's the real deal. And when you commit to Him and you start to recognize where He is and what He's doing, you recognize how much He loves you, and you'll see His hand move in your life in just tremendous ways that you would never predict if you had not committed to Him.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Craig Hazen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Thank you for just answering these questions and for sharing your passion and your love for the Lord and all your knowledge, not all of it, but some of it. And I hope in the future to have you on again. Thank you so much. Until next time. Hi, friend. Since I'll be taking a sabbatical for a little while from podcasting, I wanted to take a moment and just add a little something here at the end of the episode. As I'm sharing this, it's the Christmas season, and it felt like the right time to just share some final thoughts. If you are a regular listener of this podcast, none of this should be unfamiliar to you. I'll probably repeat myself many times, but it felt important enough to write it all down this morning. And I just wanted to leave this as kind of the bow on top of the episode that just went out with Craig Hazen, which I really enjoyed that conversation. But these are some final thoughts I wanted to throw in here. And that's just this idea of how do you find something real? Finding something real was born out of a desire to share something real about Jesus Christ with people I love who are not sure about Him. In truth, it started with wanting people I love to know that Jesus loves them. But sometimes getting into deep conversations about God, it's tricky, especially when you're talking with people you love who don't share the same belief systems that you do. It's not easy. Maybe you know what I'm talking about if you have experienced some of that. And some of you watching or listening to this might wonder, but why get into those conversations anyway? Keep your religious beliefs to yourself. Recently, even I've talked with a couple of new friends, and when they find out I'm a Christian, oftentimes they'll eventually say something like, well, I believe in letting people think for themselves, or for my children to decide what they want to believe. I don't want to force religion down people's throats. I even got more recently, what would happen if your kid decided not to follow God? And I just want to be really clear as, like I said, this is a little pause button here at the end of this sharing time. I believe in freedom, and without freedom, love isn't even possible. God didn't create a world with robots. He gave free will to human beings. We have choice and we have freedom to choose right and wrong. But just because we have free will doesn't mean we don't acknowledge choices that lead to life and ones that lead to death. Life is full of important boundaries. Think about it for a minute, okay? Let's say you're parenting a child and the child wants to run out into a busy street. You're not just going to sit back and say, oh, good for you and your freedom. You go, girl, right? No, you're going to try to stop that child from making a decision that could end their life, that could hurt them, because a misuse of that freedom could kill them. And good boundaries to freedom are designed to be life-giving. I love how one podcast guest, Zach Verrett, explained it. He said something like, God designed the world in such a way that following His ways actually leads to human flourishing. Why do we have the 10 Commandments, right? Brant Hansen, who was on the podcast recently talking with Lizzie and me, he said that when it comes to the things of what God says about what's good and what's bad, it turns out that God's not an idiot. I thought that was a great line. So I am with the person who says to me, I believe in allowing people to have freedom to decide what they believe. I don't believe in forcing anything down people's throats. And if my loved ones decide not to follow Jesus, that is absolutely your God-given choice. But the Bible says in the book of Romans that the wages of sin is death, and the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. This is life and death kind of stuff. It's not just subjective. a preference kind of thing. So don't think for a second that I won't talk about the one who said he came to give us the ultimate freedom and who says in him is fullness of life. In the Bible, it says it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. That's Galatians 5:1. In John chapter 8, Jesus said, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Note, we're all sinners. He goes on to say, so if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed. He also says of those who follow him, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So free will, we have it, but true freedom is found in Jesus. So despite what the world may say about you, keep your faith quiet. Shh, don't tell anybody. Don't shove it down our throats. Keeping silent about the captive freer, Jesus Christ, would be the cruelest thing I could ever do as a Christian. Silent about the one who in a very real sense is the antidote to the spiritual cancer we live in. I recently had an ideological conversation with someone who argued, this person argued that there are good neutral spaces, spaces and places where it's more safe for all people because they don't have an agenda. Really? Have you ever met anyone who's completely neutral? The world is full of noise. We all know that. And not one of the myriad of voices comes from some neutral Zen state of nothingness. Everyone has an angle. Even Bing Crosby in one of my favorite movies of all time, White Christmas, said that everybody has an angle because everybody has a desire for something. We were born with desire. It's part of who we are. It's part of our makeup. And as human beings, we desire our way. I want what I want. And the Bible says that God's desire is that all would come to repentance. That means to turn from our ways, our sin nature, the things that keep us from him, and turn to him. Yulia Garshagan, who has guested on this podcast several times, most recently having a beautiful raw conversation with Dagmar. If you didn't listen to that episode, I highly recommend it. She once told me that there's a lot of fake news out there about Jesus Christ, and that once people encounter the real thing, apathy fades. So how do you share something real with people you love? Well, asking myself that question led me to launch the podcast in September 2019. My first guest was a man named Thomas from China. He didn't want me to use his last name because he could face real persecution for his faith. What is it about Jesus that is so divisive? Josh White, the pastor who has been on this podcast several times. We've had quite a few pastors, but he pastors at Door of Hope in Portland, Oregon. He said that the gospel, meaning the good news of Jesus, is offensive. The good news that Jesus came into darkness to be the light, to deal with our sin and conquer death, and we can put our trust in him and be made right with God. That is offensive because it says that we are messed up and incapable of saving ourselves. And to a culture that says, you are enough, you're perfect just the way you are, shouts of pride and power, that message that you and I are sinners in need of a savior, it is offensive. It's divisive. But don't all of us know that there is a problem in this world? It's not as it should be. And there is something real to be found in Jesus. In the podcast intro episode, that very first episode that I recorded, I said, before you say, and this is mostly a quote, this podcast isn't really for me. I don't care about Jesus and I don't want to care about him. Before you check out, here's my challenge to you. I promise to take you on an honest journey. I won't pretend to be perfect or to have all the answers, but I want to share a journey towards someone who claimed to be perfect and have the answers. He says he's the way, the truth, and the life. He says no one comes to God the Father except through him. He claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to love us so much he was going to die for us. He said he was going to rise again and conquer death. He appeared to hundreds of people after his death, and most of the people who were closest to him died defending their faith in him. If nothing else, if Jesus is real, he is worth the effort of discovering him. I know the culture we live in doesn't think so. But if Jesus is who he says he is, then he offers something no one or nothing else offers. He offers redemption. He offers eternity. He offers authenticity, and he offers love in the truest sense of the word. That was my message 5 years ago when Finding Something Real, the podcast, first started. And that's still my message today as I proverbially put this mic away for a time. Like I said, the world is so noisy. And one of the things that I'm looking forward to going into 2025 is taking some time to rest and reflect and to read. I have a big pile of books that I want to read. In fact, I have some of them right behind me here. But recently, someone asked me the best book that I had read recently. And I told her about this one book. This past summer, I read a little book by a late theologian that different podcast guests had recommended, a guy named Francis Schaeffer. And the book is called The Mark of the Christian. It's just a small book, but it packs a punch because in many ways it's about how the world will know something real. Schaeffer points to the Gospel of John, chapter 13, where Jesus says, "Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Here's something that Schaeffer said about John 13. He says, "The point was that if an individual Christian does not show love toward other true Christians, the world has a right to judge that he is not a Christian." Here, Jesus is stating something else, which is much more cutting, much more profound. We cannot expect the world to believe that the Father sent the Son, that Jesus' claims are true, and that Christianity is true unless the world sees some reality of the oneness of true Christians. Schaeffer also says in the book about Jesus, upon his authority, he gives the world the right to judge whether you and I are born-again Christians on the basis of our observable love toward all Christians. That little book was my favorite this year because I wrestled with it. In reflection, I was like, is what Francis Schaeffer is saying here, is that true? Yeah, I think so. Is there someone in my life that I'm not loving well? Probably. Are there some Christians in my life right now that I'm not loving well? Probably. Has someone been turned off to Jesus because of my lack of love? I'm sure of it. So I started thinking, how do I love more? How do I love more? I wanted to love my family more. I wanted to help other people, jump right in and get going, do, you know? And my intentions were good. And so I did a lot of doing this fall. But my priorities got a little tangled up, to be honest. And friend, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've wanted to do the right thing, love better, try better, do better, and it all just falls to garbage because loving better doesn't start with good intentions or a new job or a better podcast or the perfect holiday memories you're making. Love all those things, but those things can just pile up until you feel the burden of perceived expectations, real or imagined, and your lack of meeting them. I was exhausted all these past few months because everything felt like striving. The truth is, I need something real every day. And I know where it's found. But my one-on-one time with Jesus these past few months has often felt like checking boxes off rather than just being with him, sitting with him. I've missed time with him. And sometimes, as one recent podcast guest pointed out, I think it was Josh White again, you can spend a lot of time doing stuff for God instead of spending time just resting in him. And if your priorities are straight, you can do both at the same time. But if things go off kilter, sometimes it's good to just take a step back and go to wait and be still. There's a story in the Bible of one of God's prophets having this like crazy, triumphant spiritual victory, Elijah. was his name. He was literally on a mountaintop, having a mountaintop experience, watching God's glory in a tangible way, fire blazing from heaven and taking care of the bad guys who were mocking him and crazy miracle stuff. And then Elijah finds out someone wants to kill him and he freaks out and runs away. And next thing you know, he's isolated himself, having a pity party because he says he's the only guy left who loves God and he wants to die. And God's response is, "Hey, Elijah, I love you. Get some rest and I'll take care of you. Here, eat some food. And oh, by the way, you're not alone." That's my paraphrase. And I didn't reread the passage of scripture to make sure that I got all the details right. So go look it up. It's in one of the Kings, I'm pretty sure. First or second, I'm not exactly sure. But the point is that God nurtures and cares for us when we're tired and we've gotten sidetracked. His grace is sufficient. He loves you. He loves me. He offers something real all the time. And the Bible says that we love because we receive his love first. 1 John 4:19 says, we love each other because he loved us first. In 1 John 3:16, it says, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we ought to give up our lives for our brothers and our sisters. In the book of Matthew, somebody asked Jesus, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" And Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." It's Matthew 22:36 through 40. In other words, our ability to love well starts with receiving Jesus' love and loving him back. It doesn't start with the doing. It starts with the done. Some of Jesus' final words on the cross were tetelestai, a Greek word meaning it is finished. Jesus paid it all, and we can trust that he is enough. We don't have to keep on striving. So I've been reflecting on these things and I want to love others well. And I love podcasting and I am looking forward to being back here again. And I love talking to people about Jesus. But all that starts with being with him. Jesus said that eternal life is to know him. And that is an intimate knowing that comes from time. So I'm just wanting to spend some time with him, to step back. And I want to love my family, my husband, my kids, my church family well. I want to love my friends well. And to be honest, I've just been a distracted person lately. And by loving others well, it's not like I've stopped talking about Jesus, because that in itself, according to scripture, is also evidence for the realness of Jesus. So in the meantime, I will hopefully be sending out a weekly email. We'll see how that goes. That's my prayer, that it would not feel like striving to just send that out. Very short emails just to kind of let people know what's going on, and encouragement for me as I share reflections on what God's doing. So I would love for you to sign up for that. If you haven't already, just go to findingsomethingreal.com. There's a pop-up there, or I don't know, there's something on the top of the page. Click on it and you'll receive, hopefully, a weekly email from us. No promises. And by us, I mean me, probably. But I'll keep people updated on there. I hope and pray to be back here podcasting soon. But before I go to planning things and saying yes to more stuff or signing up for projects, and this is going to be really hard, but I just want to be still and remember his restoration, his eternity, his authenticity, his love. Everything else flows from it. The world doesn't need more noise that comes from an empty vessel. It needs the outpouring of love that comes from a filled up cup. There is no substitute. Until next time, friend.